So we are really lucky, as I mentioned before, to have the president of EWA's board of directors here with us, Scott Elliott. He's in a state where there is a whole lot going on the private school choice front. So he's in a very good position to moderate this panel. Scott is bureau chief for Chalkbeat, Indiana. It's a nonprofit news organization created by journalists who believe that an independent local press is vital to ensuring that education improves. He previously served as the education reform reporter for the Indianapolis Star, and before that, he wrote primarily about education as a member of the editorial board of the Dayton, Ohio Daily News, after serving as that paper's education reporter for a decade. Scott and his colleague Mark Fisher won the 2005 National Headliner Award for education reporting for a series of stories about testing and No Child Left Behind. He also authored a reporter's guide to kind of the private school, kind of privatization of services in public schools a few years back for EWA, as a matter of fact. So Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I was thinking about vouchers as I was getting ready to come up here and realizing that we have some folks in the room who really have covered this issue in depth over a long time. Sarah Carr, who's here, everyone thinks of as like the Queen of New Orleans education coverage. People may forget that she covered the voucher movement's early days in Milwaukee. Of course, Aaron Richards covers Milwaukee now. I covered it in the voucher program in Ohio before I went to Indiana, and as soon as I got to Indiana, they started one for me to cover there. So we have a lot of people who've in the room, but there are several different kinds of voucher programs. The main general voucher programs are in Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, DC, and I didn't know about the one in Douglas County, Colorado until I looked at the Friedman Foundation's website. If you're in one of those states, can you raise your hand? So the states again were Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, DC, and Colorado. Okay, so it's interesting to know that there's a lot of folks here who maybe don't have a voucher program in their community. So let me introduce the panel, and then I'll give a quick overview of the issues. Right next to me here is Robert Enlow. He's the president and CEO of the Friedman Foundation, which is based in Indianapolis. The Friedman Foundation, if you don't know about it, is probably the #1 voucher advocacy group in the country. They have a fantastic website with a lot of good general information about vouchers. If you want to know what's going on, what the issues are, or what's happening state by state, you can find a lot of that information on their website. Let's see who's in line next. Tom Gentzel is next. He's the executive director of the National School Boards Association. And before he did that, he was executive director of Pennsylvania School Board Association, a state where absolutely nothing is happening in education and particularly school choice. So clearly the wrong guy to be on the panel. And then to his right is Josh Cunningham. Josh is an education policy specialist for the National Conference of State Legislatures, and he oversees their work on school choice and charter school policy. He previously worked for the Colorado General Assembly and is a co-founder of Colorado Taxpayers for Effective Fiscal Policy. So that's our panel. So let me quickly, I'm going to give just sort of like the three, I think are the three big categories of vouchers, voucher programs, and then I'm going to ask Robert to sort of walk us through the landscape as it stands today. So as I described before, those 5 states I mentioned have what I would describe as general voucher programs. These are voucher programs that are pretty widely open to different kinds of kids. The main limit is on income. So they're generally aimed at low income or low and middle income kids. There are also some special states with specialized vouchers. Some that come to mind are Florida, Georgia, those sorts of states where they're focused on subsets of kids, often special ed, like disabled kids, or I even noticed on your website there's a state that has a program for dyslexic kids. That was a new one for me I didn't know about. And then finally, there's this sort of under the radar component of this issue, which is the tax credit programs, which are in quite a lot of states. You might want to go look on Robert's website to see if your state has a tax credit program for families that send their kids to private schools. So, Robert, let me ask you to sort of give us a quick walkthrough of those 3 areas, or anything that I missed that I should have mentioned, and sort of what the lay of the land is right now.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. One of the roles of the Friedman Foundation is to try and explicate what's actually happening with school choice around the country, how many programs there are, what private schools are doing with those programs, how they're being impacted, and how students are being impacted. So if you look at the school choice movement, there are currently, in our estimation, 51 school choice programs operating in 24 states and DC. It's about $1.6 billion in public money being spent on families to go to non-public schools. In terms of vouchers, there are 22 programs operating in 13 states currently. And some states have multiple programs. So Ohio, for example, I saw someone raise their hand, has 5 voucher programs operating. Indiana has a voucher program and a tax credit program and a tax deduction program. So a lot of states have multiple programs, but there are 22 voucher programs operating in 13 states. Of those voucher programs, though, I think it's very important to say, there are 9 of those are for special needs families. So one of the fastest growth of programs have been in the special needs voucher programs in Florida, in Georgia, Louisiana. Mississippi has 2, as you said, it's a dyslexic, and there's one for autistic children. Then there are 2 programs in Ohio, one in Oklahoma, and one in Utah. So private schools or non-public schools are taking on children with special needs. We estimate there's about 150 or so thousand families right now benefiting from direct voucher programs, direct subsidy programs. Then there are tax credit scholarship programs. There are 18 of those programs in 14 states. You know, these are programs where an individual or a company can get a tax deduction or tax credit for a gift they make to a nonprofit that gives out scholarships, primarily to low-income families. Those are the largest programs in the country, and 1 in Florida, 2 in Pennsylvania, and 5 in Arizona. So those are currently being utilized by about 200,000 families or so. The new ones that are out there, though, are education savings accounts. This is basically, everyone's heard of a health savings account. Same idea. You have a debit card and allows a family to be able to access any type of schooling. They were primarily started in Arizona for special needs families, and Florida just passed one last year for special needs families. About 1,000 families on that right now. And then there are individual tax credit and deduction programs. Actually, those are the largest programs, but they don't really offer a lot of money. So Illinois has like 200,000 families claiming it's about $250 each for private school tuition. We don't really count those, but those are part of people accessing what would be considered tax dollars to go to non-public schools. So that's the state of play right now. There's 51 programs in 24 states and DC.
I'm going to jump next to Joe. So Joe works on legislative issues in school choice, and ask Joe a little bit about, so that's sort of the, Robert did a good job laying out the different types of programs and sort of where things stand in the country. What's going on the legislative front right now? Like, what are the primary issues that state legislatures are grappling with on vouchers?
I mean, first of all, it's whether or not to have them, I think, is a big one. So, right now, I think my last count, there is 33 states currently this year who are considering some sort of school choice legislation. And a number of those are states that don't have them. A number of them are states where they probably won't pass. But in terms of the states that do have them, it's really about defining who can have access to the program, so eligibility, and that usually involves some sort of expansion, making it open to more people, more students. And the other one is looking for ways to kind of balance the accountability of the program in terms of, how are those students doing, how can we track their performance, versus not having an overburdened regulatory environment within the program, because that really discourages the private schools from participating. So really the challenge for legislatures is how do we balance the tax, our voters and our constituents wanting, wanting to know how this money is being spent, whether it's being effective, whether it's doing what we promised it would do, versus having too much accountability to where nobody participates.
Yeah, thanks. I apologize. I think I called you Joe. Thank you, Josh.
That's okay.
Thomas, tell us from the school board perspective, you represent school boards all across the country. First of all, what is the traditional school district reaction to the widening voucher movement in these various ways, and how do you think schools are responding to it?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's good to be part of your program. This has truly evolved over the last couple of decades, I think. I grew up in an era, I'm going to date myself right at the beginning. I grew up in an era of, the cowboy shows, and there was always the white hats and the black hats. It was very easy to know. And in some ways, the choice movement kind of started that way, and I think there are still elements of that, because it was very clear that voucher programs would divert money from traditional public schools, and we've remained strongly opposed to that. Obviously, we don't think that's a good idea, and so I think the public's largely agreed with that. There's been a lot of evidence over the years that tuition voucher programs, while they certainly exist in a number of places, they don't exist in a lot of places. In part, a number of states, I think about 30 plus states, have language in their state constitutions that really specifically prohibit anything like a voucher. And so the public really is not too interested generally in diverting money from traditional public schools to something else. But I think that's evolved. It's evolved now with the tax credit debate and some other forms of school choice that it's complicated. So it's a much more, I think, nuanced debate, in part because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I think we're going to dive into this, but I think the issue for us is, well, the money is not directly taken from the traditional public schools, but it's foregone revenue. It's not going into the state treasury to be allocated to any place. And then you get into a lot of these questions about accountability. But look, we'll talk about the effects of tax credits and the fact that they maybe are a way around some of the constitutional prohibitions on the entanglement issue with religion. But they really get to the heart of the question of, well, what is the accountability expectation? And I think our membership remains very, very concerned about all of that. So obviously we want adequate funding for traditional public schools. We're not opposed to parents having the right to choose where they send their kids to school. But there needs to be accountability, and there needs to be full accountability for all public funds that are spent on education. And that's not the case in a lot of these programs. So that's why we're concerned.
So it was interesting to hear you say that you thought there was a clear constitutional prohibition of vouchers in a lot of states based on their constitutions.
Right.
So I covered the U.S. Supreme Court case decision, and in the original U.S. Supreme Court case that resolved the question of whether they were permitted under the U.S. Constitution was the Cleveland case in 2002. As a matter of fact, I happen to know it was June 27th because my daughter was born the next day, and I was very glad the decision was made on the 27th and not the 28th.
You got your story filed on time?
Yeah, I did. I mean, literally, this is actually true. My story was filed. I called my wife, and she said, "Meet me at the hospital." Yeah. Okay, so in that case, they tackled the question of whether this was in the U.S. Constitution, whether there was a prohibition, a religious prohibition issue, right? And in essence, what they said was, as long as there was a parent decision maker, even if in the Cleveland case, almost all of the options for private schools were religious options. Right. They said that's fine, as long as the person who receives the voucher makes a personal decision whether or not to attend those schools, and they have options, right? Now, like when Indiana's case came up after their program went into place in 2011, it was interesting to get a look at their state constitution and see kind of the same questions, right? And my impression is that the same questions have been at the state level in a couple different places. So in Indiana's, they, for instance, relied on the U.S. Supreme Court as a guide to that, and that case was held up. Now, I've been surprised, though. So I might honestly, like after the Indiana case, I thought, okay, well, so maybe states are going to follow the rationale of the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is going to be the direction it's going to go. And then we've had several setbacks for the voucher programs in Florida, in Louisiana, and North Carolina. So can you tell me a little bit about your, and then Robert, obviously, I'm sure you'll want to jump in here as well. But what do you think is happening there? Why do you think that the states have gone a different way?
Well, I think the answer actually is that there's some very explicit language in state constitutions. A lot of the so-called Blaine amendments going way back in the 1800s it doesn't always have a strong or a history we'd be proud of, but the reality is that the states basically said, we don't want public money going to religious schools. And I know, for example, from my Pennsylvania experience, there were 3 different sections in our state constitution that spoke to that question. So the reality was, well, while the Supreme Court spoke on the U.S. Constitution, it didn't change the state constitutions. And so in a lot of places, it hasn't even been litigated really because it hasn't gotten that far, or legislators were convinced it's not worth passing it because it's likely to be struck down. I think that's one of the reasons, maybe one of many, but one of the reasons why we're seeing more efforts in tuition tax credits and other sort of backdoor forms of vouchers, I would call it, because the direct voucher programs, I think, are not constitutional in probably a majority of the states.
So, Robert, a couple things you could start here. I know I'm sure you have plenty to say on this, but number one, could you tell us a little bit about what the Blaine Amendment is? And Indiana had one in its constitution, correct?
Yeah, most states did,
Yeah.
and I'm really grateful for Tom recognizing the sort of sordid history of the Blaine Amendment. I mean, it wasn't really anti-religious; it was basically anti-Catholic, right? It was this guy who went around every state saying, "We don't want papists getting public money to teach kids," and so those got passed in a lot of states. Now you've got to remember, though, Arizona's had those amendments, and they passed their tax credit bill through the courts. Indiana had a version of that. So did Ohio. So did Wisconsin, and they all made it through the courts. North Carolina has a version of that. It's likely to make it through the courts from what we hear. New Hampshire had an even stronger version of that, but its tax credit program got approved by the courts. So there are some cases out there currently in Florida and North Carolina. We're waiting that ruling, but we're pretty confident Douglas County has a ruling. We're less confident in Douglas County. I mean, it's going to be an open conversation, but the reality of the Blaine amendments were that no public money should go to non-public schools to teach religion, right, for sectarian purposes. And what that meant was anti-Catholic purposes. But courts around the country have said, if it goes to a parent for truly private choice, if it truly is a choice of the parent. So what the Indiana court ruled was, there is no private school in the state of Indiana that will receive $1 unless a parent chooses to go there. And hence it did not violate their Blaine Amendment as a result of that. Now, there are 3 things that you base rulings on: the actual constitutional language, and then the other one is what your precedents are, and the third one is basically what your jurors look like. And so every state's a little bit different, but on the most part, choice programs, whether they be tax credit or voucher, depending on the state, have been successful.
Josh, sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
trying to add something to this. I'm not disagreeing, although we'll find something to disagree. Because I think there is that history of these Blaine amendments, but there's something more to it too, which is a very strong tradition in our country about separation of church and state generally. And I think, today, one of the reasons there's a lot of opposition still to vouchers is people are concerned, A, about the loss of dollars to public schools, and the fact that they're not comfortable with public dollars going to private and primarily religiously affiliated schools. So it's not an anti-Catholic movement anymore. I just think there's this concern, and I think it's legitimate. I think it's fair. And then you get into these questions about, well, these are really, a lot of these are really good schools, and they're doing a great job. But we don't know what kinds of schools are going to be created and what's going to qualify as a receiving school. But I just wanted to make the point that there's that history, but I think there's more to it than just that.
Sure. And Josh, I was wondering if you had any sense. I sometimes it surprises me. There's a lot of conservative legislatures in the country that aren't going down the road of vouchers, and I wonder if court challenges are why, or if there are other issues. Do you have a sense?
Well, I think certainly I think that the constitutional aspect is a reason in some states, but in others it's just I'm trying to think of an example. A lot of the rural states, Montana, although I think they have a bill, Idaho, Nebraska, they're pretty resistant to all forms of choice. They, and for one thing, if you're a pretty rural state, what good is choice if everybody only has one school to go to anyway? There's not enough kids to have 2 schools in a town. So, it's a lot harder to sell in those places. But for the most part, the states that do have, especially the states that have passed them in the last 3 years, really since the 2010 elections, have all been Republican-controlled states. So, and that's legislature and governor's office, I believe in all of them. So, a lot of those states that kind of switched after those elections have pursued this path. But
With the potential exception of New York this year,
True.
with Governor
we'll see how
Cuomo.
that goes. We'll see.
So let me. Just going to ask questions in a couple more areas, and I'm going to throw it out to the audience to ask questions. Something that I've found increasingly interesting about voucher programs is the various effects of those programs on all the schools involved. Okay, so these effects happen on the school district, and Thomas, I'm going to start with you to have you talk a little bit about this. But one of the ideas here is that the school districts will have to compete, and if they're doing a great job, nobody will want to leave. But if they aren't, the theory is that they should lose those dollars, and those dollars should support a program that succeeds. So one question that I think is probably obvious to most reporters is, what is the effect that's happening on the school district? What's maybe not as obvious are some other school effects. I'll ask Josh and Robert to talk about these. The effect on charter schools, I think, is interesting. I think we heard some of this in one of our panels the other day. I know this happened when I was in Ohio and the program began to expand, the first thing that I noticed was it saved a lot of private schools. There were a lot of private Catholic schools, in particular inner city, that were going to be gone, but they were not. This also happened in Indiana. They stayed open because they had revenue from voucher program. On the other hand, charter schools, that particularly ones that were located near those Catholic schools, sometimes saw it affect their enrollment. So I think, I forget who said it, but somebody said it in one of our prior panels, that to some parents, a charter school seems private and is free, but they really want to go probably to the private school, whether it's a religious or not. So if that's an option, they choose that. So there's effect on charter schools. And then the other effect is on those private schools that accept vouchers. In some schools, I've seen that really change the nature of the school. So if you're a small, mostly homogeneous inner city Catholic school, and of let's say 150 kids, and then you take 100 voucher kids from the neighborhood the next year, you're a really different kind of school. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things I think are interesting effects to look at. But Thomas, let's talk about effects on school districts and traditional public schools first.
Well, first of all, I think it's clear that there's probably much more choice within the public school system today than there was 10 or 15 years ago. We can debate why that is. I think some of it may be because of the choice movement. I think some of it is just sort of the nature of our society. The old notion that special orders don't upset us. I mean, I think everybody sort of wants things customized in some way, and I think public schools are reacting to that. Here's the question, though, I think, the overarching question for this, which is whatever form of choice that we're talking about, if it's public tax dollars going to a non-public school, sectarian, non-sectarian, what are the requirements for them to be held accountable? And in our view, any school, public or private, that receives public funds should be reporting on exactly the same basis, exactly the same. There should be no exceptions. This is essentially a nutrition labeling argument, right? If it's parental choice, parents need to be able to choose and decide on school performance using the exact same measures. And frankly, this isn't just about parents. Most of these tax dollars are coming from other than parents. They're coming from the 3/4 of the people that don't have kids in school. And so taxpayers need to be able to know that these schools are being held accountable in the same way. And we've not seen that. Now, I think Robert and I probably agree that there should be accountability. I'm not sure he would go as far as I would. But the point is, that's one of the missing ingredients in a lot of these discussions, or there's a lot of carve out, or, well, we're not going to report everything exactly the same way. And I think then the bigger question is, what is our policy objective? Is it just to create choice and competition? Is it to help certain selective groups of students, disadvantaged students, for example? And the answer to that's kind of not clear. I mean, it depends on the program, I suppose. One of the studies talked about the fact that parental satisfaction was actually a poor measure of effectiveness of the schools, because we know the parents make these decisions based on a lot of factors. It may be that this choice school is more convenient. It's down the street, and the school my kid otherwise would go to is across town. I don't know. But if our goal is that we want to improve school performance, if that's what it's about, and then we set up alternative programs and essentially a second system of funding education, and these other schools are not performing even as well as the traditional public schools, I think that's a huge public policy question, and it's not being answered. Certainly we're asking the question, but there's a lot of other answers other than the answers to those questions.
And so I think where there are areas of agreement, we actually might have found some of those areas where we should have good dialogue. One of those would be, for journalists in particular, if you think non-public schools are not accountable to the state legislature, then you need to go read the rules and regulations on non-public schools in the state legislature. Some state legislatures, for example, in North Dakota, require all public schools to teach the state curriculum. Some require, before you get to a voucher program like in Indiana, the schools to take the state test if they're state accredited. Every state has a different results for non-public schools, but the legislatures can make them accountable to what they want them to be accountable far before they can have a choice program. Now, what's the impact of choice on a school, right, in terms of private school and regulation? We did a study called Public Rules on Private School Choice, where we looked at all the rules and regulations on private schools before a choice program was introduced, then in the first year after that, and then in the years after. And so, for example, in Milwaukee, for the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, the largest growth in accountability was in reporting, paperwork and reporting. They have 25 new sets of regulations on the private schools to report. So there is a lot of accountability that we have already on the non-public schools. I think the real question here is, what do we mean by accountability? Because my first point would be, if we mean by accountability that which we have been doing in our traditional sector, that hasn't worked for quality at all. If by accountability we mean accountability for results and transparency, then that's a much different conversation. If we mean a more robust conversation about accountability, like financial, I would love for you all to go and ask every one of your school boards, not school boards, school districts, to say, give me a budget to actual with variance, starting out with cash at the beginning of the year and ending cash. My guess is you will never get that. So I think there's some questions about the kind of accountability we have. In Indiana, I think we got it right on our private school choice program. Private schools that are taking the program in Indiana, if they are rated, whether you like A and F systems, if they're rated D or F for any 2 years in a row on the state test, they cannot take new students in the third year. And they cannot take new students again until they get themselves above a D or an F. The first year that they became eligible for that, there were 7 schools on that list. The next year, 5 of those schools got off the list, because there's a clear accountability measure for the results, i.e. you lose the ability to bring kids in your school. It's a financial metric. So I think if we're talking about transparency and accountability for results, my argument is I would love traditional public schools to be as accountable as those private schools in Indiana. Don't allow traditional schools to take new kids if they're D and F for 2 years in a row. So I think we have to look at the type of accountability going forward. What do we mean by that? And if we mean something different than what we've been doing, that's great. But as you heard the former panelists, we don't want to homogenize all the schools. I mean, I sort of feel this is the 21st century. We can have some differentiated conversations about quality. So I don't think we fully disagree, but there's some things we disagree on.
Yeah, and I would just say, this area particularly intrigues me because, I mean, I don't think anybody wants a child in a school that's underperforming, certainly chronically underperforming. But I've seen voucher proposals that are presented that are essentially, and I think this is particularly disingenuous, but they would use students who are disadvantaged in that kind of a school as sort of a battering ram to get a voucher program passed. But very quickly the program would change to incorporate a lot of other students who are not in that category. I mean, if we're really serious about that, then these programs would be very limited to certain kinds of students, to give them who are in a school that is underperforming, public school, and it would be extremely limited. But that's not what happens, and they tend to grow, and that's what I was saying. And I mean, you and I can't really answer the question because the question varies by state, but the real question overall is, what's our policy objective in all this? And if people say, well, this will improve school performance if we're going to have choice, we've not seen that evidence. There's no compelling evidence that charters or vouchers substantially outperform the traditional public schools. You know this data. A lot of them significantly underperform. And yet that's kind of okay because we've created choice. Well, I don't think we've answered the policy question. If choice is good for its own sake, but we're seeing poorer performance in some choice schools, then I don't get that at all. I don't see the point of supporting a second system of education that's going to do even worse than the first one. And by the way, can I just say very clearly, because I have to say this, the public school system, generally speaking, today is doing far better than it ever has before. And I think this is overall a great success story. When you talk about the fact that public education historically had a sorting function, right? I mean, some people would go on to the professions in college and all that, but everybody else got a basic education. We've asked in the last generation that public schools educate all students to a high level, which we should do, and we're doing. And so we're seeing NAEP scores up, graduation rates up, dropout rates down. So I don't want the context for this conversation to be that public schools have gone to hell, because they're getting a lot better. They've been good. They're getting even better. So that's why I think this policy question of what are we trying to do is critically important. If the perception is, well, public schools are failing and we need choice, I would challenge that strongly, because that's simply not the case.
Josh,
Get
did
off
you
my
want to
soapbox.
add anything on this topic, Josh?
Sure. I think, well, for one, Robert, you talked about Indiana and not letting schools accept new students. That's the case in Indiana, I think Louisiana, but most of the states that's not the case.
That's correct.
You have a state like Arizona where it's just, in Oklahoma, same thing. There's no measurement of those students. They don't have to take the tests. They don't have to. The schools don't have to report their performance. You don't have any idea. It's just expected that they rely on the free market and parents to understand. But if their kid is doing poorly in a school, then they should go find a new school. The problem with that is a lot of times parents don't know whether or not their kid is really doing well or not. But I'd also go back to the original question, which was kind of how it affects other schools. And I thought this point on the charters was interesting. Research shows that charter schools actually draw a lot of private school students. So the private schools are really hurting from charter schools. And they also draw a lot of homeschool students. Into the school system, which adds to the cost to the state. The state then has to pay more because they're educating kids that didn't have to educate before. So you add to the cost. You introduce a voucher program. Like we said, a lot of those kids then will migrate to the private schools, which kind of counteracts some of those added costs that the state was seeing. And so it's an interesting effect that they have for sure.
Yeah, let me just say on that, when I was in Dayton, Ohio, it was fascinating to watch when the charter school movement began. After it had been up for a couple of years, I remember I started asking the Catholic school folks, like, are you worried that you're going to lose kids to the charter schools? And what they basically did was look at their numbers after 2 years and say, almost nobody transferred. We're in the clear, right? By year 5, a bunch of schools closed, right? Because what happened was the kindergarten choice makers were choosing charter schools over private schools because of the cost barrier, right? But then basically, at least in Ohio, and this is something to look out for if you're in a state that has a voucher program where they're talking, a charter program where they're talking about vouchers, is really vouchers in Ohio were partly brought into to come to the rescue of those private schools, because after some of the private schools closed, then suddenly the vouchers were there, and that saved others from closing. So
Let me quickly add, there is some data, right? There's some data that show that on the voucher programs, not charter schools, I'm not talking about, nor necessarily tax credit programs, and I think that's a glaring hole we have. Florida is the only state that actually has done what I consider to be rigorous studies of its tax credit program. And they're finding that there's some small gains on test scores, but not huge. Where the gains are is in graduation. Like in what DC has found through the president's own Department of Education is that if you're receiving a scholarship or a voucher in DC, you graduate 21% higher than your peers. So there's completion rates and attainment things that go on, and then continuation in college. Again, that's not at all. I am one of the most vociferous people in the country saying that we should not look at vouchers based on failing public schools. The idea here is public education, from our perspective, is something we should all support, but public education is very different from public schooling. What we have is public education and public schooling being the same thing. They're not. In this society, we've agreed to fund education of our citizens. That education can be and is provided by multiple sectors, and probably should be. What we're suggesting is that all that money that we set aside be allowed to go to parents to choose whatever sector they think is best, whether it be traditional run, charter, private, or at home, or online, or blended, so long as there's some transparency and some accountability with that. The programs that you mentioned in Arizona and Pennsylvania, those are the least accountable. If you look at most of the other programs, particularly the voucher programs, they require some kind of state testing. And then the question then becomes is what kind of state test? There was a bill in Indiana this year that said non-public should maybe be allowed to take any nationally normed reference test. And our position on that was, well, sure, as long as that would apply to the traditional public schools as well, and we can include growth and have bridging questions. And that got with some support, and I think that'll come out in our summer study committee. So I think from our perspective, the key here on the policy side is dollars following kids. While school funding is complex, if I take my kid from one county in Maryland to another county in Maryland, dollars are going to follow him at some point during the spectrum. And so we're just wanting that same thing for across school types.
So
Thomas, go ahead, Josh. Yeah.
I would just, and you might have more to say, but I think it's important to note that, the effect that a kid leaving a public school for a voucher program has on that school, I get the argument that a lot of folks make, that school has fixed costs that they would have to pay for, that they're relying on that revenue. But schools lose kids for a lot of reasons, and the voucher programs tend to be a very small fraction of the reason why kids are leaving the school. A lot of kids move away, a lot of other reasons why kids are coming and going. And so I think we're talking about 1% to 2% of the state's student population participating in a voucher program. To say that it has a significant impact on a school's budget might be a bit of an overstatement.
Well, but what about individual situations? I mean, like, typically we're not talking about, Indiana is really the only program where it's one program for the whole state. I mean, in some states they have a statewide program, but it usually grew out of individual city programs. So typically this is focused, Robert, you don't like this at all.
No, it's because it's $160 million for the voucher program and $8.5 billion for the traditional public schools.
Yeah. Well, but in terms of like, are voucher programs having an effect on the public school system of Indiana in a big way? No, but are they having an effect on a school district?
I wanted to comment on something you brought up a few minutes ago.
Go ahead.
I didn't get in.
Yeah.
So I do want to say that I think Robert and I would agree on this. I think what's actually happening, the sand sort of shifting under our feet a little bit, is that there is a redefinition of the term public education.
That's right.
And I'm not sure that I like it, but I think it's happening. And so what we're saying now is public education is any education that's funded with public tax dollars. It can happen a lot of different ways. It can happen through vouchers or tax credits and so on. Look, in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, just one of the debates I heard people on the other side say all the time, the money should follow the child. And it was interesting to me because the money didn't follow the child into the school district. There wasn't a funding formula in that state where there was a fixed dollar amount per student. But I'll tell you, when the money left, it was a lot more than that district typically got per student. But here's the reality. This money, if this is what's happening and we're redefining public education, then I want to repeat what I said. I respect parental choice fully. But these dollars that you're taking are not just the parents' dollars, they're taxpayer dollars. Most of the money that's being used, whether it's tax credits, vouchers, is coming from somebody else. And they have a right as taxpayers, we all do, to make sure that these dollars are being well spent. And so what's intriguing, troubling, concerning, you can take your pick, any one of them works, about tuition tax credits for me, and this I think came out of the Arizona decision. Well, it's not really public money. These are really private dollars that these parents are spending. Well, really? I don't think so. I mean, I don't see it that way at all. It's a tax credit, but the reality is this is money that's not going into the state treasury. It's not going to be spent on other goods and services for the state. And so here's an example. A number of the states have these school tuition organizations, right? So the money, if a corporation gives some money, they get a tax credit to support education, and the STO decides on how to allocate it. And there was at least one case I read about where parents wanted to take their kids on a trip to Europe using some of this tax credit money. Now the STO in that case said, we don't think that's going to qualify. Well, really? I mean, is this the accountability system where some appointed body just sort of makes a decision on how we're going to spend money? I would much rather, of course I'm biased, but I would much rather have elected officials, school boards, other people that can be accountable for how these dollars are being spent. That's the slippery slope on school choice, is that the money can go to a lot of different places, it's parental choice, but it's other people's money and it's not being held accountable. That's our concern.
And I would only add to that, I think this would be the area. I do not trust our current elected officials and or any other elected officials with the current state of accountability of how our money's spent. So we've looked at school choice across the voucher programs since 1992 to 2011 and 12, the 10 that were passed. Found that after you accounted for kids that would have gone to private school anyway and the kids in the program who left, there was $1.7 billion in net cumulative savings to states. But we cannot find out where that money went. It somehow got back in the coffers of states or was utilized for some other public good. So I appreciate the need to be transparent. I'm not sure our current accountability systems when it comes to funding transparency are there at all in our current system. Again, I would go back.
But Robert, shouldn't they be in place first? I mean, that's the question I'm asking. If we're going to go down this road, and I have a lot of concerns with it, obviously, but if you're going to go down that road, then the first thing you do is you put the accountability system in place. And then you build your system. You don't try to build an accountability system after the dollars are being distributed. And by your own acknowledgement, we're talking billions of dollars.
Yeah, and I'm not fully disagreeing with the need to have an accountability system. One way to do that is to ask traditional public schools to do gap accounting, right? Just to do accrual-based accounting instead of cash backwards accounting.
Okay,
Right.
before we go down that road of accounting,
That's really boring, I know, but
let's take some questions. So raise your hand if you have questions. Microphones will head in your direction.
Hi, I'm Scott Travis at the Sun Sentinel in South Florida. I was wondering about these schools and how the ones that are getting the scholarships or the tax dollars, the private schools. I believe the state law says that they have to take some kind of standardized test, but it doesn't say which test it is, and they don't have to report that to anyone. And apparently, if you ask the state for those results, it's very difficult to get. And they don't have they're not required to take the main state assessment that's based on Common Core. And I was just wondering if there's any way to know whether these schools are good or whether we're giving money to something that's basically a diploma mill, but because we don't know how they're rated, we don't know how well they're doing, we don't know if they're good or bad or whatever.
So the current Florida program for the tax credit requires schools to take any nationally norm reference test and report those scores to the parents in the school. So that's the level of accountability that's direct to parents currently. So they're taking, it might be the... Public can't access that. I think not yet, although they do through the David Figlio report. I mean, it's all in the David Figlio report of the tax credit program. So he's looked at all the individual schools and their performance on those tests. So
now you said you were for that kind of accountability. Should they have
I'm
that
for
in Florida?
transparency. They should have definitely the ability to go and take a look at what's happening at those schools.
How about reporters?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. Just making sure you're cool with that.
Oh, sure.
The challenge, though, right, is if they
No,
can give
not at
any
all.
if they can give any norm reference test. I'm back to the nutrition labeling argument. I mean, I don't know how you compare different school performances if they're giving different tests. So the reality, I'm going to be pretty blunt about this. Any school that receives public funds can't turn around and say we can't be held publicly accountable in the way that other schools that receive public funds are accountable. And so that's why the accountability system, I think, is absolutely it's the linchpin to this whole discussion.
But in high school, I mean, what do colleges use to get entrance? Now, what tests do they look at? Do they look at the FCAT or do they look at ACTs? Do they look at SATs or do they look at the FCAT in Florida? So if you really want accountability, let's have our high schools only take SATs and ACTs. Right? So, I mean, we have this whole testing structure and this whole system of standards that's a whole nother conversation that we could be having.
Robert, I thought we were going to agree on that. Come on. No, look, I don't think that's a valid argument at all in terms of this, because in this case, And in this case that we're talking about public tax dollars. A college can decide to admit any student they want and use any basis for that, and they'll have to defend it to their trustees and others. But in this case, the defense has to be to the public. There has to be accountability, and that's my point. It's not consistent across the board.
Also, there could be a school that could be failing everybody on those remedial tests, but they're not having to turn it in to the state. They're only turning it in to
Their
parents.
parents and the researcher. Now, I will tell you that in Florida on the tax credit program, the schools are required to have certified teachers. I mean, that's some of the accountability. There's a lot of accountability on that sort of input stuff. They're required to have, since the choice program, it's on our public rules and private school choice. I'll be happy to send it to you.
I
Josh?
do believe the state actually dictates which norm reference exams they
Yes.
can take as well.
That's right.
So it's not just any test. It's the
That's
state
right.
has to approve the test first.
That's right.
Aaron?
Erin Richards, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Robert, I'd like to know if you would be willing to support any additional measures of transparency or accountability when it comes to academic or reporting requirements for private schools. So for example, as you noted in Milwaukee, voucher kids do have to take the same state test. They have to report the results. That is the only data I can get about performance in the schools. I can't get suspension data. I can't get high school graduation rate data. I can't even get a roster of teachers' names from the schools. There's just very little I can get to talk about internal operations. Are you willing to support any legislation that would call for additional reporting for those schools to have to report anything else besides just one state test score
So
result?
that's a great question, and I'm not even sure I would support just one state test score. I mean, I report test scores, whether it's an approved state test, I would agree with. I think we need to be careful, Aaron, to make our private schools look like our traditional public schools. Now, what does that look like? What would I support? So I think in Milwaukee they do have to do background checks for teachers. They should report that, right? That's an important function to make sure that teachers will have background checks. But do you need to know the name of a teacher to know if they're doing any good? If they have outcome data they should have graduation reports. I definitely agree with that.
Well, the state requires them to have a bachelor's degree, but there's no way for me to check that against an institution if I don't know their names.
Fair point.
Or could they at least report it at, aggregate numbers, if nothing else? Could every school have to do a report on what percentage are certified or something like that?
They do have to do certification
All right,
reports,
yeah.
right? I mean, I thought.
And the teachers don't have to be certified. They only have to have a bachelor's degree.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
bachelor's degree?
Oh, so it's different. Okay.
I've got to look that one up.
Well,
May
he's
I
gonna
ask-
craft
may I
some
ask, is that
legislation.
I'm gonna
subject
look
to
that
any
one
kind
up,
of
Aaron.
audit? I don't know. Is that subject to any kind of outside review or audit? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean,
So it's
the schools
self-reporting?
do have to meet some financial. The state oversight is mostly on financial
Right.
measures, so they have to turn in forms and count the kids and whatnot. But in terms of actually getting any kind of additional data on internal operations, from discipline to academics to status of teachers, the public isn't allowed to see any of that. And I'm just wondering if would the Friedman Foundation support any additional measures on that?
And the answer to that would be, it would be a case-by-case basis. to be
That's not
honest
very
with you.
specific.
How
know.
about the case of Milwaukee?
I've got to go look at Milwaukee right now.
Okay.
Can I just say though, Aaron, the other issue to that is back to the public schools, because they are reporting all of that. They're reporting all of it, and so if the story you write is in the Milwaukee School District, you have these cases of discipline, and it's all being publicly reported, but it's not being reported by these other schools that receive public tax dollars, then that's also not. I mean, it could be an equally bad experience for these other schools, but you'd never know it. And so the perception then is the public schools are doing worse.
Other questions? Right here. Say your name.
I'm Annie Martin. I'm from the Daytona Beach News Journal, so I'm also a Floridian, and I've written quite a bit about the tax credit scholarship. I've learned that it's very easy to start a private school in Florida, and it's also very easy to be eligible to receive money through the tax credit scholarship program. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, does any kind of requirements should be put upon private schools that want to receive this money in terms of, being able to prove that they are actually educating students and they are, actually teaching them? It occurs to me that, and I'm not saying this happens, but it occurs to me that, a school could be putting students in front of a TV all day and we may never know, and that may be allowed to continue for years. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what the requirements should be to be able to receive this money.
It's a great question, and I appreciate that. My answer to that would be much like we did in Indiana. Open at the front, quick out the end, right? So allow more in at the beginning, and we understand there will be some issues with that potentially. But once they've not done, at least in Indiana, the testing, and we could even include potential graduation rates, I certainly think some of that. Once they've not done, then they should not be allowed to take new kids after a certain time until they've improved, right? So I would rather see an open entry, open spigot, and a very quick exit.
Josh?
I can't remember which state it is, but I don't know if it's something to consider or something that's in the statute that requires the private school to have been open for
Louisiana.
2 years, I think, which could potentially, you have to be able to prove that you can sustain yourself as a school, a private school, without the support first. Which in going back to the in Milwaukee, where we see a number of private schools that are 100% voucher students enrollment, pretty much were set up just to take the voucher kids, which I assume is perhaps happening in Florida too.
There is an inherent tension here, right? Because states have compulsory attendance laws. And they all do that because we want children to be required to get an education. That's important in a democracy, all of that. And so at least, and Robert may disagree with the results here, but the reality is, at least in the traditional public school system, highly regulated by state government legislation, state regulations, it was all directed, maybe not effectively, but it was all directed to making sure that those kids were receiving the education that the public said is needed. And so the tension now is, if dollars are going to go to a private school and they want a lot of flexibility in what they teach and when they teach, but they want the public dollars, that's tension. And I'm not sure there's been a good answer to that question, but it has to be answered. And again, I go back to this isn't just about the parents. It isn't. And it's the public at large that expect the young people to be educated in their community. Now, they may be open to how that happens, but they have a right to expect that all children are being educated at a high level.
Other questions? Hey, while we're waiting for the next question to come up, can we talk just for a moment about tax credit programs? So I think this is an area that's somewhat underreported. People tend to focus on the big voucher programs, but let me start with Thomas. Like, from your perspective, is it more worrisome, these the tax credit programs, and why? And then Robert, you can follow with why not. Thomas, go ahead.
It is worrisome because again, I think in a number of places, and actually Pennsylvania, where I came from, is a good example. Voucher programs were tried several times. They were shot down even by Republican-controlled legislature, but tax credits suddenly started catching on. And I think part of the charm of that is, to those proponents, is that they can argue we're not taking money directly from the public schools. No money is leaving the public school system, forgetting the fact, of course, this is foregone revenue, as I said before. It's seen as private money rather than public money. It gets around some of the entanglement issues with religion. And so I think it's very concerning. And look, some of these tax credit programs are advantaging public schools as well. And so
how does that happen?
Arizona's got a huge tax
well, and in
program.
Pennsylvania, so that some of the schools can benefit from the tax credit money.
A public school. You can
Public school.
you can use your tax credit how?
For example, if a corporation made a contribution through a tax credit program, they could contribute to a public school program, which there's a part of me that, I even respect Robert. Okay, that's the kind of person I am. And so when I look at legislation like that, I say, well, that's a brilliant political move, right? Because now you're saying, well, this is a way for public schools to get some more money. They're not going to go up and actively lobby against that in the way that they would against vouchers. So I think it's troubling only because, at least with the voucher program, it was a stark contrast, and you could argue, look, these are tax dollars leaving the public schools, and they should be held fully accountable. Somehow we're not having that same discussion around tax credits, and that's the debate we're trying to force. If it's tax dollars going to a private school, they should be equally reporting as the same as the public school.
Let me hit Josh, and then I'm going to let you. Then I'm going to let you finish that.
I'm reading stuff for Aaron.
Josh, what's interesting to me is our state legislators. So as Thomas said, there's a direct feel when you have a classic voucher program, general voucher program. Like the schools are all freaking out because they can see the dollars coming out of their pocket. But in this case, they can't. But as he said, this still comes out of the state. Do you hear legislators worry about that? I mean, either side of the fence here.
No, I think that the tax credit programs politically are easier to pass, and through the legislature. I think for a lot of those reasons, it's not public dollars. We see a lot of. I mean, there's been more state. If you look at the bills that have been introduced this year and the last few years, it's the same story. You know, over half the bills are for tax credit scholarship programs and not for vouchers.
But tax credits that does bite the state budget at some point, right?
It does, but it's harder to measure, and they also tend to reach more students because the scholarships tend to be a little smaller. And the fact that, again, it gets around a lot of the state constitutional issues because it's operated outside of it's a privately operated program, essentially. The only role the government plays and the state plays is offering the tax credit, but it's funded privately. The scholarships are issued privately. So in a lot of ways, I think it's easier to sell because there's not that fiscal note attached to it that you might have with a voucher program.
So, Robert, this sounds like we've solved all of your problems. This is a perfect solution. We don't need any more general voucher programs. We can just do tax credits, right?
Well, no.
Why not?
I would think so because, look, first of all, tax credits have been established, and they are considered legally money separate than the general budget, right? It is, even though it is considered not foregone revenue. I wouldn't use that terminology, of course, but states like Indiana and others will say, okay, we know we have to give our 12 million in Indiana or 7 million. It's going to be not revenue coming in, so they put that into their budget.
Not revenue coming in, but it's not foregone.
Yeah. So
I mean,
as long as you say it's not foregone for traditional schools, right? Because they use tax credits for lots of different purposes for social good. Right, there's lots of different purposes that states use for tax credits, right? Look, I'll tell you what Dr. Friedman would say on this. You know, you need to have dollars following kids directly to the school of their choice. And in tax credits, while great, and they're in some ways they're wonderful, they're helping thousands of families, almost all low income in Florida, access choice schools. And look at the Figlow report. I guarantee you that they'll give you a good sense of those schools and how they're performing. You know, it's helping, but I would much rather see a direct dollar amount go and have a much better and broader conversation about what does a robust system of accountability look like across school types, and what does it look like to have differentiated accountability, right? It's okay to have differentiated accountability because with public schools or traditional public schools, you may want a higher level of reporting because it is run by the state. But we have a lot of things that the state offers money for to other companies, and they have different levels of accountability. That's okay, so long as you can show results and so long as you can agree on what those results are. Less inputs, more outputs. And Aaron, I've got all the regulations we could go over that private schools are supposed to do.
Caroline.
Hey, we're almost out of time, but I just thought I would ask you all to look ahead a little bit. Right now, in this legislative season, are there states where you see voucher programs being expanded or new voucher programs being put in, tax credit programs being expanded or new tax credit being put in, any kind of imminent, you're right, any accountability, new accountability measures being put in for voucher or tax credit programs in the immediate future? Where are the hot spots that reporters should keep their eyes on?
That's great. Well, last year, the 11 states enacted school choice programs. Two states were new, Kansas and Florida, new programs, and then 9 states expanded. Every year, states are expanding their programs. So every state that has school choice is either going to expand it or modify it. I know in Wisconsin, they're doing a very large modification right now and expansion. But the hot spots looking forward, I would look at Arkansas. I would look at New York. I would look at Maryland. I would look at Nevada. I would look at Mississippi. And the policy side of it is there's a lot of education savings accounts in terms of going forward. And the one thing I want to, this is growingly, let's see the right way to say this. So sometimes people argue the school voucher programs are partisan. What's happening now is you're seeing a significant shift away from support in some areas from Republicans for choice and more support from Democrats for choice. And what you're seeing now, a lot of that's in the rural and suburban areas. If you look at all the polls in the country, if you want to look ahead, the people who don't support school choice the most are typically white suburban women.
Where are the Democrats into this?
Well, you got New York, right? You're growing. So all in Florida, for example, half the Black Caucus voted for the voucher bill and the expansions. Now the states, the last 3 voucher states haven't seen that, but we're starting to see some in Indiana. We're starting to see some growth in the. You're going to see, I would assume, in Illinois, some interesting Democrats come out for school choice.
Thomas, what do you see going ahead?
Well, I won't go state by state, but I think there's 2 things I want to make sure I point out here. One is that some of this debate is driven by people, and I think I would put Robert and some others in this category, who I think believe passionately that choice is a good thing and will improve education. But I got to be really candid. You have to look at who else is in this debate. There's a lot of what I would call dark money that's going into campaign contributions to legislators of both parties that are promoting a choice agenda. And so some of this is coming from groups that frankly are determined, I believe, to undermine public education generally, and they see this as a way to do it. So this isn't just a philosophical debate that we're having. There's a lot of money driving this. The other thing that's concerning me about it is state, the economy is starting to come back. State revenues in a lot of places are starting to improve, and there may be a temptation to expand tax credit programs and some other things because of the availability of revenues. And so that's something else I think to be keeping an eye on.
Yep. Josh, did you want to add anything else? And then we'll wrap up.
Josh knows.
I think, again, Robert mentioned that the ESA is really growing. That's really the biggest growth in terms of the different forms. I think we'll see that emerge, perhaps even start replacing some of the traditional voucher programs, because it offers the parents a lot more flexibility of how they use the money. So I'd look for that. Again, we see a lot of states consider these bills and a lot of states defeat them. So it's really hard to say. We might get a couple this year. We'll see. Going forward beyond that, Tennessee has been trying. They've come close every year, but I think we'll see how the 2016 elections go. The legislatures, Republicans had a lot of gains in 2014. However, they didn't flip a lot of complete state control, so they might have flipped one chamber. So right now I think it might be most ever divided legislatures. And so going forward in 2016, how those legislative chambers play out and who gets control will really determine the future of these programs.
Let's say thanks to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.